So I have a strange question maybe that I want to ask you this morning. You don't have to raise your hand or nod your head. You can kind of answer internally. How many of you enjoy when someone comes up and gives you a hug? Some of you do, probably. How many of you don't really like it? There's those among us, right, that don't like when people touch you, at least people that you don't know all that well. I can remember serving my last church. I was told early on, not fussed at, but just told early on, now, preacher, you know we're a hugging church here. We expect you to hug us, which I don't know if the church I served previously was just emotionally detached, but hugging was not a part of my Sunday morning routine. And I'm going to confess to you that outside of the people that I know and love and care deeply for, I'm not the one who's going to come up and give you a hug all the time or put my arm around you. A handshake's fine, but I like my personal space, right? I mean, don't you? Personal space is important. Don't violate my personal space. I was thinking about that this week, this notion of how uncomfortable I get, and maybe some of you get, with human touch. And I found an article online that talked about the power of human touch. Babies, for example, long for human touch. I remember when my first was born, and she's so little and fragile, and you just think if I touch you the wrong way, you're going to break or something. And of course, Katie, being the wise pediatric nurse, said, no, it's the opposite with babies. Don't be delicate. They want a firm touch. You know, they've been in their mama's tummies for 9 months. They want a good firm touch. That firm touch is what signals love to a baby. And the article even went on to say that they have done studies of childhood development, that children who were not physically loved enough, there are benchmarks that they fail to meet. There's child development issues that come up. Human touch is a sacred thing. This is why we also spend time and teach children at an early age. It's a very sacred thing, human touch. You know, there are people who can touch you. There are people who can't. There are ways that touch is appropriate, and there are ways that it's not. But we do this because there's a sacredness to human touch. Me being weird and, I'm not the hugger. I remember a mentor telling me after I told him the story of my last church. He said, Ben, think of it this way. You have no idea who in your church, Sunday in and Sunday out, are lonely. And that one hug you give may be the only human contact they have all week long. So I had to get over my whole personal space thing. There's power to human touch. We hear this morning from Mark's gospel 2 stories where Jesus uses the power of human touch to heal. It's really neat how Mark sort of lays out the stories. Let's think about them real quick. There's story 1, which actually bookends story 2. So we get to story 1 halfway through, story 2 interrupts, and then story 1 finally concludes. Jairus, the leader from the synagogue, comes to Jesus and says, my little girl is going to die. She's so sick. Is there anything you can do? Anything at all? To which Jesus, of course, in his infinite mercy, says, yes, let's go. So they're on their way when he's interrupted. A crowd, we're told, gathers in around him. And there's a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years. She's tried every medical solution possible. She's seen every doctor. She's gone broke because her insurance doesn't cover it anymore. It's expensive. And she's no better. In fact, she's worse, we're told. And she says, in a last-ditch effort, I am so desperate that if I can just touch Jesus' coat, maybe something can happen. I want to offer a couple side notes about both of these stories at this point. Number 1, I think it's pretty significant that Jairus asked Jesus, come lay hands on my daughter. I think about that term, lay hands on. And I think back to 4 years ago. I gathered, the annual conference session was actually here in Savannah. And I was voted in as an official elder to be ordained in the United Methodist Church, literally right here in this sanctuary. We held the vote. And that night, we go over to the Civic Center, and the bishop laid hands on me to ordain me. Ordination, to ordain, literally means to lay hands on. But we do more than that just for preachers. At baptism, we lay hands on each of you to ordain you to ministry too. Jairus asked Jesus, "Come lay hands on my daughter." That's more than just healing her. That is, to lay hands on her is to give her a new story and a new future, something that she never imagined possible. But by the power of God, it's there. That's one side note. The other side note, this woman who's bleeding. You understand, this is pretty risky what she's doing by touching Jesus' coat, because the law said that whenever a woman experienced menstrual bleeding, there's this whole process of exiling herself from the community until it's over, and then there's a purification process that to get back in, and all this stuff that you have to go through. And that's hard enough when it happens once a month, but this woman has been nonstop for 12 years. This woman has been exiled from the community of faith for 12 years. And she puts Jesus at risk, by the way, because you weren't supposed to touch a bleeding person in this way. That made you unclean because they were ceremonially unclean. So she's actually gotten Jesus into trouble with the law by touching him. So let's conclude story 2. Jesus, the law says you don't touch an unclean person. This person does not need to be in the community of faith until the bleeding is over. The law is laid out, Levitical law. But Jesus, in his infinite mercy, says to her daughter, "You are well." That is to say, daughter, you are welcome back into the community of faith. It's powerful. However, at this point, word comes that Jairus' daughter is dead. 12 years old. For those who have children, can you even imagine the loss of a child and the gut-wrenching pain that her parents must have felt? And 12 years old in Jesus' day, this was your launch into adulthood. She has the future in front of her, and she's cut down so early. But Jesus, remember, he's in the business of laying hands upon her, writing a new story for her. And he does just that. "Little girl, get up," he says. And from that point forward, that little girl has a new story, something she didn't even have. It's not that he restores life to the way it was. It's new life. Something new has happened. She forever will be known as the girl that Jesus raised from the dead. She was dead, and look, she is now alive. That's a story. That puts a purpose on your life. That's powerful stuff. Both of these stories telling the story of the power of human touch. So what do they mean for us, you're wondering? Those are great stories for Jesus, but what about us? Let's go back to our confessional. I said it out loud. Some of you thought it inside. We're uncomfortable with human touch. Like, personal space, don't violate it. I don't need to be touched. And yet, we're told by science that human touch is actually a very powerful thing that can heal or help the healing process. What gives? Think back to a moment in which you were really hurting. And I mean just gut-wrenching pain hurting. Heartbroken, despair, everything you could imagine, just hurting. In that moment, or somewhere around that moment, do you remember the feeling when someone embraced you in a hug? Or put their arm around you? Or even just a gentle touch on your shoulder? Do you remember that feeling? It was remembering that you're not alone, that somebody loves you and cares for you. It's a powerful feeling. And yet we get uncomfortable when we talk about human touch. It's, well, I'm hurting, that's okay then, but not in ordinary, everyday life. It occurs to me that probably my problem, maybe yours, with human touch is To let someone hug you and embrace you, to let someone draw you into them through touch, is to make yourself vulnerable. And nobody likes to be vulnerable. We struggle, I think, as a culture, with vulnerability. We're taught to be strong, to be powerful, to be mighty. My personal space is like this protective armor around me. I don't want you violating it. And if I let you do it, then I've made myself vulnerable somehow. And vulnerability is uncomfortable. Why? Because it comes from a dark place that reminds us of hurt and pain. To be vulnerable is to make ourselves feel a little weaker. To be vulnerable is to trust somebody enough so as to not hurt us. Vulnerability is very difficult to embrace, isn't it? To be vulnerable is to go against everything that we're told strong people are supposed to look like and be like. In fact, we would rather pretend like we have it all together and that life is okay, even when we're hurting inside, even when everything is just aching. We'd rather pretend like everything's okay than to be vulnerable enough to say, I'm hurting. I can't figure it out. I don't know where I'm going next. My heart is utterly broken. We'd rather pretend like we have it all together. But look at the vulnerability of these two characters in Mark's gospel. First, the woman. She is vulnerable enough to break the social rules because she is that desperate, to cry out for help. Have you ever been that desperate to cry out for help? It's to admit that you can't do it on your own. It's to admit that you need the help of somebody else. It's to admit that you're not strong all the time, that there are moments of weakness, that there are chinks in the armor that we try to carry around with us every day. But this woman, so desperate for something, for healing, is vulnerable enough to put herself in a risky position to be healed. And Jairus, we tend to get caught up on the fact he was a leader of the synagogue, like, oh, I thought all the leaders of the synagogue didn't like Jesus and they didn't get along. But back up a half step. Jairus is a leader. And we're taught that leaders are strong. And leaders have it all together. And leaders lead out of this place of strength and might. Leaders aren't supposed to be weak, ask for help. Leaders are supposed to have it all together. And yet Jairus lets himself be vulnerable enough to say, I have nowhere else to turn. I love my daughter that much that I don't care if it makes me look weak. Something has got to give. Vulnerability is something we can embrace. Brené Brown's a great sociologist, and she writes a lot about vulnerability. One of the things she says is that we don't like vulnerability because it comes from this dark place in us that reminds us of these hard experiences we've had in life, the hurt that we've experienced, the pain. No one likes to be vulnerable because you don't want to go back to that dark place at all. But she said the irony of it all is this. Vulnerability is also the place where some of the most amazing things are born inside of you too. You don't know what joy is about until you've experienced sorrow. Then you know what true joy is. You don't know how to be empathetic unless you know how to come from this place that you were once hurt too. Henry Nouwen says that we can be empathetic and become wounded healers. That is to use our brokenness and our woundedness to help others who are broken and wounded too. Brené Brown tells the story in a TED Talk about her 13-year-old daughter. Comes home from school in tears and says, the girls at school are so mean and they didn't want to talk to me, and they said that they were making fun of my clothes. To which she, being a mom, immediately said, well, I bought you these new clothes. Why aren't you wearing them? And she said in that moment she had to stop and remember, I was once that 13-year-old girl. I was once rejected. Don't be the mom and fuss at her. Be the person who says, honey, I'm so sorry. I know what it feels like to be rejected, and it hurts, and that stinks. So often people come to us in our daily lives, and we want to give them all the advice in the world. Do this, do this, do this, do this. when all they really want to hear is, I'm so sorry. I've been there too. You see, that empathy comes from that place of vulnerability. Because upon hearing someone else's hurt, you don't go to that place where you know what's best for them. You go climb into that dark space with them and you sit down with them and you hold their hand and you say, I don't know what's going on either, but I'm going to be here with you. Or maybe better yet, you just don't talk at all. That's to make yourself vulnerable. To remember that all of us are broken, that all of us hurt and have been hurt at some point or another. And we can share in that together. Frederick Buechner, I read an article from him this week on this passage, and he said there are two moments that are so powerful in this story, and they really stuck out to me when he pointed it out. It's the two moments in which Jesus addresses the people that he has healed. The woman who's bleeding, exiled from the community, on the margins. No one wants to be around her or touch her. And in a word, Jesus sees her and says, daughter. That's to give her a place of honor. She is important. She's had 12 years. She's not been anything. Daughter. And the second is, in that tender moment, did you hear it? The little girl's lying there, dead. Jesus grabs her hand. And he tenderly says, little girl, get up. You're healed. You cannot hear God's great I love you until you first hear God's word, which is I see you. I see you for everything you are, God says. The good and the bad, the ugly too. I see you in your brokenness. I see you in all the stuff you carry and pretend like you're okay when you're really not. God says, I see you. But in that moment, God also says, daughter, little girl, old man, old lady, son, you who struggle to find direction in life, you who wonder if you'll ever meet somebody to share your life with, you who just lost someone really important and you're hurting inside, you who are struggling with the big decision and you don't know where to turn, you who have what some call an alternative lifestyle, which is just another way of judging you and being mean, you who want nothing more than to live the life that God has made for you, all of you. God says, get up, be healed, go in peace. There's mercy for all. Amen. Hey, thanks for watching the latest sermon here at historic Trinity Church in Savannah, Georgia. I'm Reverend Ben Gostin. I'm the senior pastor here at Trinity Church. And I want to take this opportunity to invite you. If you're ever in Savannah, Georgia, we would love for you to visit us on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. We're located on Telfair Square, been here since 1848. Also, you can check out the comments below for a way to give if you feel so led. Again, you're welcome anytime here at Trinity Church.